The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everyone, and greetings from Saudi Arabia. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us this morning for this brief update from Saudi Arabia based on the last few months of Saudi hitting the headlines. Obviously, a lot of news from Saudi, particularly in the defense and security sector. And we're delivering this webinar in partnership with the UK Department for International Trade and our good friends at ADS. Just some housekeeping. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. We're going to have time for questions at the end. You'll note on the right-hand side of your screen there should be a panel that would allow you to submit written questions. You can also contact us after the webinar if you have any further questions that we don't have time to go through this morning, and our details are on the final page. Please make sure, obviously, your speakers are turned on. You're all muted, so you can start talking if you like, but nobody's going to be able to hear you. In terms of the agenda, for those of you that were tuned in for our previous webinar, the agenda will be fairly familiar. We'll run through a bit of news from the kingdom, a bit of an economic update, and then focus in really on the defence and security issues and, of course, opportunities for British and other Western business in the region. A little bit about AEI. I'm sure most of you will be aware of us by now. We are the exclusive partner to the British government to provide market entry advice, guidance, market research, due diligence services for British exporters looking to do business in the kingdom. We actually support clients from 35 different countries, and we've now helped over 700 companies with their journeys in the kingdom. We also, in addition to consultancy, provide support services and manpower services where we seek to provide a range of services that are to deal with anything that is difficult, inconvenient, or impossible for a foreign company to do on the ground. So, without further ado, it's obviously been a very busy time for Saudi. The kingdom historically has liked to maintain a very low profile in terms of news headlines, but certainly since the accession of King Salman and the appointment of Mohammed bin Salman, who we refer to as MBS, as the Crown Prince last year, there's been a continuous, very steady pace of significant change in the kingdom. And it should be noted from the start that a lot of the change, or all the change that's taken place, has taken place in a peaceful, progressive and proactive way, and is very much supported by Western governments, particularly the UK government. And that pace of cultural change has been unabated, certainly over the last 12 months. And just in this week, we've seen wrestling arrive in Riyadh. We've seen cinemas opening and the showing of the first film in Saudi for 35 years. Big headline-grabbing events. Also, the Riyadh Marathon. You can see a picture of the start line in the bottom right-hand corner there. They were expecting 3,000 or 4,000 runners for the Riyadh Marathon. 26,000 people registered. and 15,000 people actually turned up to run the race. I'm not sure how many of them actually finished the race, but there were 15,000 people there on the start line. Hugely impressive, a reflection of the appetite of this young population in the kingdom to support Vision 2030. Aside from cultural change, we're also now seeing in 2018 a number of new and significant revenue-raising measures that have been introduced. Of course, the main one is VAT, which came into effect on the 1st of January. And here we are 4 months into VAT, and the system appears to be working fairly well. The government has been now receiving VAT revenues from VAT returns from large companies on a monthly basis, and the SME sector submitting their returns on a quarterly basis, is obviously contributing to a significant build-up of cash in the coffers of the government. We're yet to see a significant amount of spending, but we'll talk about that in a few slides' time. There's also revenue coming in from the sin taxes that were introduced on fast food, on energy drinks and things like that, and then also the removal of subsidies from cigarettes, fuel, water. There's also been a revenue stream coming in from anti-corruption, which the big investigation was, of course, in November last year, and there's been approximately about $100 billion raised in fines and settlements agreed with people who were caught up in that. Again, there's some debate as to whether or not 100 billion has actually been received or if that's what's expected, but nevertheless, it has proved to be a significant source of revenue. Further challenges do remain. It's obviously fair to say that women driving presents a huge opportunity for the kingdom from a cultural and economic perspective, but the prospect of an additional million or two drivers on the road presents a number of challenges. There have also been a number of unforeseen institutional issues. For example, the requirement to employ female police officers and various other relatively unforeseen impacts of allowing women to drive on the Saudi security, police, and insurance industries as well. Of course, you'll be aware that there have been a number of missile strikes on the kingdom emanating from Yemen. These are effectively flat pack missiles that are shipped over from Iran and then assembled in Yemen and sent north towards the kingdom. And we've had a number of high profile headline grabbing attacks, if you like, in Riyadh, although damage has been very minimal, and the Royal Saudi Air Defense Force have managed to intercept most of the missiles that have come over. But nevertheless, it contributes to the overall feeling of uncertainty, if you like, in the kingdom. But the general mood is everything is moving in the right direction. We spoke about revenue-raising measures, but cash flow and funding still remains a key issue for the Saudi government. Some Saudi contractors still remain having payment problems with the government, and then particularly in the construction and infrastructure sector, there remain significant challenges. And then the other news, of course, is MBS's foreign tour. He's now visited the UK, the US, France, and Spain, probably the top 3 or 4 allies of the kingdom, particularly on the defense and security side. And we'll talk a little bit more about the outcomes and the results of that trip in a couple of slides' time. In terms of the economic picture, well, it remains mixed. I think that's fair to say. There are those people who are very bullish and very upbeat, but the reality on the ground, for those of us that are here in Saudi, we can see that things are certainly moving in the right direction, but challenges remain. the construction and infrastructure sector remains really in a pretty bad place. It's emerging from the depths of 2016, 2017, but the impact of delays in government payment and in the stopping of awarding of new contracts have really affected particularly the Saudi end of the supply chain particularly hard rather. And there have been some very high-profile casualties. Saudi Oger, one of the top 3 construction companies, has gone under. The Bin Laden Group, the future of the Bin Laden Group remains uncertain. There is currently a lot of talk about the government taking on a significant stake in a part nationalization of the Bin Laden Group. The thing that seems to be holding that up is the Bin Laden Group's the Bin Laden Group debt, which is running at about $43 billion, which for a number of years was bigger than the national debt of the kingdom. And it would seem odd if the Saudi government were to take on that sort of liability. But there has been some good news, and we're certainly seeing a recovery in 2018. The King Abdullah Financial District, they're trying to get that back on track, and there are a number of big Western companies involved currently looking at how to complete the construction phase, and then also a number of consultancy companies looking into the regulatory requirements that would need to be put in place to enable foreign banks, particularly and financial services, to get going in the kingdom. And we've had other major infrastructure programs announced that are in the design and consultancy phase. For example, the land bridge between Jeddah and Riyadh, which is part of a kingdom-wide rail plan, which eventually, hopefully, will see a high-speed rail line between Riyadh and the eastern province of the kingdom running across the new causeway into Bahrain. The retail sector is obviously gearing up now for Ramadan and the Eid shopping bonanza over the summer. But retail, although point of sales are up by about 9% year on year, reflecting the restoration of allowances for civil servants and a bit greater money in the greater sort of cash in the economy, the retail sector is going to be hit, I think, this year by enhanced Saudization requirements. It looks like there's going to be a mandatory Saudization of all retail posts, so in shops and supermarkets, by the end of the year. The cost impact of that is going to be quite significant, and a lot of people are suggesting there's going to be a contraction in retail space in terms of numbers of stores and that sort of thing in the kingdom. It's generally fair to say that at the moment, major spending is on hold whilst the Vision 2030 infrastructure is established. And what that means is that they've spent obviously a lot of time, particularly with the support of the Ministry of McKinsey, to develop strategic plans and goals. They have the National Transformation Plan, but the ministries themselves are now getting to grips with what exactly they have to do from a organizational, cultural change perspective to deliver the ambitious goals as set out in Vision 2030. And over the last 12 months, really, we've seen the establishment of a number of vision realization offices. This year, we'll see the establishment of a number of PMOs to lead privatization efforts. And also the Public Investment Fund has been getting its own house in order in terms of creating entities that will benefit, if you like, principally from government spending and then be privatized at some point in the future. And we've also seen new regulations and the establishment of new authorities, particularly in entertainment and sport, which will provide governance over these relatively new sectors of the economy. We think that's going to carry on still in 2018, getting this sort of government infrastructure in place with a view to the back end of 2018, major spending commitments to be launched. Obviously, all these will be done competitively, and those of you that are familiar with Saudi will know that the tendering process here can take many, many months. So we think towards the end of this year, there will be more RFPs and tenders issued with a view to major contracts being awarded into 2019. Obviously, those of you that have consultancy-focused businesses, 2018 will be a very positive year for you. Those of you working on major equipment programs or looking for major infrastructure programs may have to wait until the end of the year to see opportunities emerging. So the outlook remains positive. The new sources of revenue are kicking in. The government coffers are filling up. Obviously, the oil price is currently quite buoyant, remains volatile, and the volatility, if you like, is driven principally by uncertainty around the US position with regard to sanctions on Iran. And we've also got political issues in Venezuela and Nigeria, which continue to add to that uncertainty, which is driving the oil price. Bear in mind that Saudi Arabia makes money on oil at about $10 a barrel. So it's currently floating. The OPEC basket, I think, is about $70 today. It's still a significant source of revenue for the government. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on explaining the role of the Public Investment Fund. You'd have to forgive my rather naive PowerPoint skills in producing this patronage tree to try and demonstrate how the PIF will function. This is very much my own creation, so this is not a sort of formal graphic produced by the PIF, but it's our understanding based on being here in the Kingdom as to how the Public Investment Fund will set itself up to be the vehicle to deliver Vision 2030. In broad terms, each sector of the economy will have a branch that will flow from the PIF, and there will be a PIF entity that will effectively control, coordinate, allocate government spending in that particular sector. We've already seen that, obviously, in entertainment, in training, in mining, in oil, and of course, most pertinently in defense with the establishment of SAMI and GAMI. And we'll talk about those in a second. The broad idea is that these entities will receive government contracts, manage the procurement and the contract management of those projects through performance and delivery. At the same time, they'll be absorbing capability to be able to stand up as a going concern, as a genuine business. And when they reach a critical mass, they'll then be privatized in part, probably about 80%, to raise revenue for the government, and then obviously to bring in more private sector influence, knowledge, know-how, experience, and of course capital and investment. In terms of the defense branch, those of you who've been keeping an eye on things in Saudi will have heard of GAMI and SAMI. GAMI is the General Authority of Military Industries. This is basically the government entity that's likely, currently sits broadly under the Ministry of Defense, but will actually sit outside of a ministry fairly soon, and is responsible for looking at regulatory matters across defense, things like offset, but also for the first time will have a role in coordinating procurement across the defense sector. So the defense sector comprises the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of the National Guard, the Ministry of Interior, and the Presidency for State Security. GAMI's role will be to look for procurement opportunities where they can get volume from those four sources of requirements with a view to industrializing. Those of you, again, who are familiar with doing business here will know that one of the reasons why industrialization has often failed in the Kingdom is because of the segmented nature of the market, and they've never really been able to get the volume needed to justify the non-recurring cost associated with establishing a production line or a capability, manufacturing, support, whatever it may be in the Kingdom. The PIF entity, if you like, that sits at the end of the defense branch is probably going to be SAMI, Saudi Arabian Military Industries. And SAMI, we can talk about this more offline. They have 4 principal business units looking at land, air, munitions, and defense electronics. They're going to be the main vehicle, if you like, for most of the defense sector industrialization activities. They're still quite nascent, still quite immature, and they're still trying to find their place amongst not only other PIF entities that operate in the defense sector, but of course the private sector, the privately owned companies, including the economic offset companies that are already set up in the kingdom. And we're expecting to see at some point, probably later this year, if not into 2019, an agreed position of what SAMI will do and what the existing private sector will do. But there's been a flurry of activity, of joint venture announcements between SAMI and the major prime contractors. But as yet, all of those are just nice words, MOUs, rather than actual entities created on the ground. A couple of other PIF entities in the defense sector that are of relevance. ELM is mainly focused on training and security and IT services for the Ministry of Interior, but it's owned by the PIF and has a greater role now to play both in the Ministry of Defense and the National Guard. Tahakum is also a similar entity to ELM, a former sister entity of ELM, owned by the PIF, again operating in this sector, also delivering training. And then we have TACNIA as well, which is also playing, if you like, in the defense and aerospace sector. Government-owned. TACNIA are a partner to Lockheed Martin for helicopter support. They're a partner to Antonov, looking at cargo aircraft assembly in the kingdom. There's a lot of overlap between these entities and what SAMI is supposed to be doing. So we're expecting to see a rationalization, if you like, of the government entities that are in the defense industrialization sector. And that's probably going to follow the announcement of a new set of offset regulations. We're expecting a royal decree maybe before Ramadan, but it might be pushed out, which will announce the establishment of a new offset system in the kingdom to focus, if you like, international prime contractors, obviously particularly in the defense sector, on delivering what Vision 2030 is all about, which is jobs for Saudi nationals and revenue diversification for the government. So in terms of what's been going on in the defense sector specifically, so we're going to talk about opportunities here. I think the first point to make is, yes, of course, MBS had a very high-profile tour of the UK, the US, France, and Spain. But what was actually signed, we've had a lot of MOUs, but there doesn't seem to have been any purchase orders, if you like, actually signed yet. Certainly broad commitments, but we've heard a lot of these commitments before, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the third and fourth quarter of the year after the summer to get these MOUs turned into contracts. It's interesting, if you look at the 3 pictures on the right-hand side, it sort of illustrates the slightly different approaches that countries, if you like, are taking towards business development with MBS. We have obviously that fairly cringeworthy video of MBS and Donald Trump taking MBS through his picture board of what he's thinking about buying. You've got the bottom picture of a selfie there between Macron, Hariri, and MBS. And then we have the slightly more formal picture of MBS meeting Her Majesty the Queen. In the Saudi Ministry of Defense, they're now in the process of standing up their transformation team. This is a very significant number of people, over 500 people from the Ministry of Defense, from the different branches of the Ministry of Defense that are being pulled together to look at transforming and, if you like, giving the Ministry of Defense the Vision 2030 treatment with a view to looking at better value for money, more joint training, joint procurement, and of course actually looking at the operational effectiveness of the Saudi armed forces from an organizational, doctrinal, and also from an equipment perspective. In terms of major programs, well, in the land forces, we are expecting the long-awaited tracked vehicle programs to be announced. They featured heavily in the discussions between Trump and MBS. These are obviously Bradley, M109, M88. They have been long-standing requirements for upgrades and for additional vehicles. These sorts of things will all be done through FMS, through foreign military sales, and there's an innate conflict there between Trump's desire to get deals and jobs in America with MBS's desire to have industrialization in the kingdom. And we're yet to see how that is going to play out in terms of who's going to be flexible in terms of that sort of assuring that mutual prosperity. On the Royal Saudi Air Force, and I should say actually, SAMI have been heavily involved in the land sector initiatives. So they have been looking for a land sector partner. They've been considering the Americans, the French, the Koreans, and a number of other sort of national offers, if you like, from countries that can offer a particular capability to see and to help SAMI grow its land business. As yet, they've not really announced what direction they're going, but clearly, if the main focus for the land sector is going to be tracked vehicles from the States, it's probably going to have a significant American flavor to it. For the Royal Saudi Air Force, there have been less headline-grabbing opportunities because a lot of their money has been tied up, if you like, already on the significant expansion of the F-15 program from a couple of years ago. But it was in London when MBS signed an MOU, again committing the Saudis to discussions around acquiring another 2 squadrons of Typhoon. These discussions have now been ongoing for at least 5 years, and the general mood seems to be that they're heading towards signing a deal probably in October or November of this year. That'll be for another 48 aircraft. There's going to be a significant in-kingdom participation program associated with that. The UK prime contractor for the Air Force program is BAE Systems. They're already assembling Hawk aircraft here in the kingdom. They already have a significant footprint. So it probably is all just coming down to price negotiations at the moment. But as I said, those have been ongoing for quite some time. So hopefully we'll see some movement in over the summer. Where I suppose there's been most discussion, which is quite unusual, is in the naval sector. The Royal Saudi Navy has traditionally been fairly poorly funded, but has had a number of high-profile and fairly public failures in its capability with regard to the naval blockade in Jeddah, off the coast of Yemen, with regard to the recovery of downed pilots and things like that. And there's been a talk for a long time about a number of major naval programs, and they've centered now on 2 main requirements. One is LCS, the littoral combat ship coming from the States, as part of the SNEP 2 program, the Saudi Naval Expansion Program, which will not only include the acquisition of the Lockheed Freedom class LCS, but also a range of shore facilities, training, and ancillary services, at least $10 billion probably. And then there's also the Spanish Corvette program. They're looking at 5 corvettes from Navantia in Spain, probably about $3 billion. The issue is, of course, whether or not the Saudis actually have that money, and whether or not they actually have the appetite to spend it on the Navy, which has historically been has not attracted huge amounts of funding. It would seem difficult to come to the conclusion that both those programs are going to be funded. I would think that the likelihood of the Spanish program going ahead is higher than the American program, but politics is obviously the key focus here, and the MBS's and the Saudi government's desire to support Trump and support the Americans in a bilateral show of friendship may result in the signing of SNEP 2. But it's a lot of money, and it's a big ask for a Navy that doesn't necessarily have so-called blue water ambitions. At the National Guard, well, the National Guard, those of you who will recall that the Guard faced a significant change in November last year when the Minister, Prince Miteb, retired, and a new minister was appointed, Prince Khalid Al-Ayef. We have now not really seen a huge amount of information about the future of the organization in terms of its structure. Is it going to be transferred under the Ministry of Defense? What's its role? But they have appointed a transformation minister. So a senior is actually the brother of the Minister of the National Guard, Prince Mohammed, to look at the transformation opportunities for the National Guard. We think this is the Guard getting their house in order, ready to receive the Vision 2030 treatment. And again, they have come under the auspices of GAMI in terms of oversight of procurement budgets and that sort of thing. The future organization is still uncertain. There is some discussion around losing air capability from the Guard and parceling that up between the Army Aviation and the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior's aviation capability. Some future programs are under active discussion. There are tenders out underneath the UK government-to-government program, the SANCOM program, and FMS programs are still progressing. So government-to-government business does appear to be carrying on, but direct programs and local procurement has pretty much dried up as they're waiting to see the impact of transformation on the Guard. In the security sector, well, we had a significant restructuring, if you like, last summer when the Ministry of Interior, which at the time was the largest ministry, a mega ministry of over 350,000 people, was broken up into pretty much a organization that focuses on police passports and prisons. It's doing it a slight injustice, but that's principally what its core offering is. And the Presidency of State Security, which is the counter-terror forces, the special emergency forces, the special security forces, the intelligence services, reporting directly to the King, so no longer lost in a mega ministry. They've been able to prioritize, if you like, the counter-terror focus of what used to be within the MOI. For the Ministry of Interior, Hajj is obviously remains the key priority. We've got Hajj coming up over the summer. There'll be about 3 million visitors to the kingdom in a 10-day period. It's a huge challenge for the Saudis. There was a lot of talk about a number of major programs for the Ministry of Interior, particularly on borders, particularly on Coast Guard, fleet replacement programs. There doesn't really seem to be much appetite currently for major programs, and those requirements that existed are either being reevaluated or are being broken up into much smaller, more manageable procurement tranches. In terms of cybersecurity, we've seen quite a bit of activity in the last 4 or 5 months. What was the National Cybersecurity Center has been replaced by the National Cybersecurity Authority. A new Minister for Cybersecurity has been appointed, Musaid Al-Iban. Iban is also a member of the Finance Council, the Economic Council and the Political Council. He's a sort of core acolyte of MBS, and he has taken over the remit of what was the National Cybersecurity Centre. The cyber sector is still in a state of flux and is now in a period of transition as IBAN moves forward with his own agenda. There's been a new prime contractor has been appointed called Citco, the Saudi Information Technology Company, which is taking over from TCC, Technology Control Company. Again, those of you familiar with the security sector will know all about TCC, and their apparent demise has been long trailed, but now appears to actually be taking place. We'll talk a little bit about regional issues. Obviously, it's difficult to go into too much detail about these huge subjects that we could easily spend hours and hours discussing and debating. But again, I think it's equally important that people, particularly in business development, people who are making decisions about where to focus business development resources and funding, have an appreciation of what's going on in the region and why Saudi Arabia remains the largest export market for Western defense and security companies. I'll just say at this point, if you do have any questions, please start submitting them because we're coming to the end of the slides and we'll start the Q&A in about 5 minutes time. In terms of the broader regional issues, well, we're always asked about what is actually going on with Qatar and what's the impact of Qatar. Well, I would urge all of you to watch an interview with Adil Jabir, who's the Foreign Secretary. He gave to CNN on the 5th of November last year, where he explains very clearly and very articulately what the Saudis' view of the issue with Qatar is. And basically, they are saying that they view it as a very minor issue. What has actually happened is that a number of demands have been leveled on Qatar by the Saudis and the Emiratis, supported by the Americans, and they have moved on most of them. There's a couple left to do. One of them, of course, which seems a very difficult requirement to achieve, is the closing of Al Jazeera, Al Jazeera Arabic, the Arabic news service. But otherwise, the Saudis seem quite triumphant that they've forced the Qataris' hand to move on financing regulations and various other things that the Americans have been trying to get the Qataris to do for a number of years. In terms of a resolution, again, we don't really see a significant opportunity or a significant appetite to resolve things. It has to be said, though, that Hajj does present an opportunity for the Saudis to potentially offer a hand of friendship, if you like, to Qatari pilgrims looking to come to the kingdom. So we might see some movement over the summer. Of course, everything that's going on, whether we're talking about Syria or Yemen, it's all has its roots, if you like, in the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And of course, these countries like Yemen and Syria and Qatar, they have very complex national narratives that are not easily distilled down into a sort of media-friendly soundbite of goodies and baddies, cowboys and Indians, or Sunnis and Shiites. But moreover, they are complex situations. So in Syria, for example, we this week have Saudi forces in Turkey on joint exercises with the Turks. That was there's a lot of debate as to whether or not that was actually going to happen. And of course, people are suggesting that might be a precursor to some sort of involvement by the Saudis in resolving the Syrian crisis with boots on the ground. Again, that would be a huge step for the Saudis to actually do that. They've never deployed forces beyond their own borders, really. And if Yemen has perhaps taught any lessons so far, it's that decisions to go on expeditionary warfare should be taken very, very seriously. In terms of Yemen, there does not appear yet to really be an end in sight. Obviously, the demise of Abdullah Ali Saleh has delayed things. But again, as we approach the summer and Ramadan, there is an opportunity for resolution. Saudis remain committed to their initial vision, which was to bring the disparate peoples of Yemen under one constitutional settlement. What exactly that means, with a view to the secessionist movements, particularly in the south, is we're not entirely clear. But certainly the pressure from the US, Mike Pompeo has been here this week. He has raised both Yemen and Qatar with MBS. We know that Macron, France, actually got himself into a bit of bother when he appeared to be lecturing MBS over Yemen. And there's no doubt that they're feeling the pressure from the West. But of course, there is a question as to what can they actually do when you have missiles being fired from Yemen onto towns and cities in Saudi Arabia. They can't not react. So that basically concludes the core part of the presentation. And I've got a number of questions that have been submitted, which I will start answering now. In terms of the slides, I'm more than happy to share some of the slides with people. If you would like a copy of the slides, please just send us an email at the end. I would just say one more thing, which is this great picture which we stole from The Economist a few years ago, which, just to remind everybody that it's an extraordinarily complex situation, and you don't necessarily need to understand the ins and outs of everything that's going on, but having a basic appreciation is certainly worthwhile. So we have a question of, could we elaborate a little on the agent-distributor relationship when it comes to defense contracting and supply? Well, this question has probably been raised on the back of relatively new enforcement, if you like, of regulations that are suggesting that the Saudi Ministry of Defense in particular will not buy equipment from agents. There's actually been a long-standing regulation that they wouldn't deal with agents. But it's, as I said, it's now being newly enforced. And the reason is because there is still the perception that Saudi agents don't particularly add a huge amount of value. They don't add a huge amount of value, just adding a 10% margin for doing very little. The challenge, of course, is where agents do have a manageable and meaningful work share. It doesn't fit, if you like, with Vision 2030 to say, well, if people are actually bringing capability into the kingdom, they should therefore not be eligible for to bid on particularly defense sector opportunities. So what we're seeing is a lot of our clients are having to move their agents onto sort of subcontractor commission-based agreements, where instead of a contract flowing through the agent, they simply receive payment for the performance of services in support of the delivery. And it is reflective of a change, if you like, in culture at the MOD to say, for equipment supply, we will deal only directly with a foreign company. Another question, do you think there is a reasonable possibility of the GCC coalition sending troops into Syria? Well, I think we've addressed that. It would be a very challenging thing for the Saudis, certainly, to undertake. I think more likely they would approach other countries like Egypt or Pakistan to do the heavy lifting. So we have a question about the cybersecurity sector and how cybersecurity fits into Vision 2030 and the PIF role in that domain. That's a great question, Fahad. At the moment, there isn't really a huge amount of Vision 2030 targets, objectives, or principles that relate to cybersecurity. What we think is that IBAN, the new minister, they have created a company called Citco. It looks like Citco is going to be transferred over to the PIF at some point, and that will become the PIF entity that will deliver cybersecurity. Outside of the sort of more traditional cybersecurity in terms of network security and encryption, those will remain with the end user. So the Ministry of Defense, for example, the Patriot network, the command and control systems that they're looking to bring in, all the encryption requirements associated with the Air Force, those will all be maintained, if you like, by their end users, and so won't necessarily have a direct role for the PIF. I have a question about the roles for UK, or the opportunities for UK SMEs to support the CAXT initiative. That's from Steve Ashley. Steve, perhaps we can talk about that offline. In terms of CAXT and where CAXT fits in, that's the King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology. Basically, this is a very significant research and development institution in the kingdom, headquartered in Riyadh, with a broad remit. It started off in support of the oil and gas sector, but now supports most sectors, and indeed companies like Tatnia were spin-offs from CAXT, looking at commercializing CAXT technology. The opportunity for SMEs in the kingdom, for small and medium-sized businesses, remains massive. Of course, there are great challenges, particularly for SMEs, particularly as to relate to payment. But there's support available from the UK government to support SMEs, and there are institutions like CAXT who are very supportive of engaging and introducing SMEs to the Saudi market. Well, I think that's about it. I'm happy to answer any more questions offline, as I said. Otherwise, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for listening. You have our contact details at the bottom of the screen there. Please do drop Freddie an email if you have any further questions. Thank you.